For this section, we will take a look at the Office of Governor of the state of Texas and other governors and the different state agencies involved in the executive branch. First, let's take a look at the roles that the governor plays. So roles of the governor. Number one, the governor is the chief legislator. Now, of course, we have our legislature, which is, the House of Representatives and the state Senate, who actually make the laws, but the governor should have an agenda. The governor should have things or priorities that he would like to make into law. That is just something that that should be done. The governor shouldn't be passive in this respect. So the governor should have an active agenda of legislation to recommend to the legislature and works to pass that agenda. Okay, so there's things on the table that the governor wants, be it dealing with business, taxes, education, whatever. The governor should have some kind of plan, and because of the high profile of the governor has the opportunity, because of the high profile, to get these things passed. He has what's called the bully pulpit, which means that when he calls a press conference, all the major statewide news organizations show up, and so people get to know what the governor wants, and the governor can sell his agenda to Texas. Also, the governor is the party chief. The governor should be the head of his or her party and represent that party. Many political parties have differences within the party, and the governor should be above the fray, and should, not always, but not always is, but should kind of be the one person that every member of the party can rally around. The governor also has ceremonial duties. Anytime major dignitaries from around the United States or around the world visit Texas, the governor should be there to greet them. Attends a lot of functions and dinners, and just doing all the things that somebody in a high position should do. Also, the governor is a crisis manager. The governor should provide strong leadership in times of a natural or man-made disaster. So when things like in the town of West, when they had the big explosion, of course the Governor Perry at the time went to visit, kind of helped organize the response to that, and played the role of crisis manager. When hurricanes hit the Texas coast, usually it's the governor that's one of the first ones to declare a disaster, and oftentimes the governor will go visit the affected areas. And also, the governor is the intergovernmental coordinator. That means the governor should coordinate activities with other state governments. States have their own, even though the 50 states are very different, they have their own similar issues and priorities that they want to work towards. And so the governors of each of the individual states, including Texas, should work together in order to attempt to achieve whatever goals they're striving for. Now, what are the qualifications to be governor of Texas? Well, one, you have to be 30 years of age. And when the Texas Constitution was written, the current one in 1876, you were pretty mature if you were 30 years old. You're pushing middle age, because many people didn't live past the age of 60, 65. Also, you must be a U.S. citizen and a resident of Texas for 5 years preceding the election to where you are voted in as governor. So those are the formal qualifications. Not a whole lot, very simple. Now, there are also informal qualifications. Informal meaning that they're not written down anywhere, but it just kind of works that way, that you must be these things, and they're not 100%, but it's likely that you must be one of these things in order to become governor. Most governors have served in previous elected office. Okay, rarely does a governor show up where he has not or she has not worked his way through the political process, either as a state legislator, Oftentimes it's as a state legislator, or oftentimes the U.S. congressperson or a U.S. senator. The most recent governor that we had that did not go through the process of ever, running for and serving in another public office before becoming governor was George W. Bush, the governor prior to Rick Perry, who later became president. All have been white. Um, Most all of them have been male. Just off the top of my head, I can think of two females, Miriam Ferguson back in the early 1900s, and Ann Richards in, let's see, I think it was the late 1980s. Most all are well educated. They go to, they all have most all of them have college degrees. Many have graduate degrees, and they are generally wealthy. Of course, the wealth is kind of a requirement to serve in the state legislature because of the very low pay that state legislators get. So therefore, if they're beginning the process of climbing the political ladder by starting in the state legislature, they're generally already fairly wealthy. And of course, when they become governor, uh, based on the informal qualifications, they are wealthy as well. Now, as far as the salary of governor of Texas, the salary of the governor of Texas is about $150,000 per year, and that falls kind of in the middle of the low and the high range amongst other states. The lowest, $70,000 a year for the governor of Maine, and the high, $179,000 per year for the governor of New York. Of course, as we know, we just mentioned it in the previous unit, the governors of Texas is paid much more than the actual legislators in the House and the Senate. Uh, the Texas governor, along with that $150,000 salary, also receives housing with the governor's mansion, a car and a driver, access to a plane, and reimbursement for travel expenses that come out of his or her own pocket. So it's a pretty good gig if you can get it. It pays fairly well, and it has some good perks. Now, with regard to succession, meaning who replaces the governor, if the governor dies in office or resigns from office or is impeached or removed from office in some way. Well, in Texas, the lieutenant governor, who is elected, now remember, the lieutenant governor is elected separately from the governor, but just like, which is different, of course, the vice president, the president, but still the lieutenant governor does replace the governor if he leaves office. Also, the lieutenant governor acts as governor when the governor is outside the state campaigning for another office or really for any purpose. The lieutenant governor acts as the governor. So kind of takes over the reins and probably makes minor decisions. But if there's any major decisions, very likely the lieutenant governor will contact the governor in order to clear it with the governor, any major decisions. Now, most every state has an ability to remove a sitting executive or a governor from office, and the state of Texas is no different. In fact, the state of Texas's process for removing the governor is basically exactly the same as the process for removing the president, which includes impeachment and conviction. The first step of the process is impeachment. And in this process, the House of Representatives meets and they look over what might be the evidence against the governor. So usually it's some kind of criminal action that the governor has done that would cause the legislature to pursue impeachment proceedings. So they're going to take a look at the evidence, and they might hear witnesses and have hearings and things like that, and then they will vote, and by a majority vote, if a majority, meaning just 50% plus one, if a majority deems that there is enough evidence to put the governor on trial, the governor has been impeached. Okay, it's very similar to an indictment in our court system. When you get indicted for a crime, you're not convicted of the crime. It's just determined that there's enough evidence to put you on trial. And that's what impeachment is. It's like an indictment. The House of Representatives finds that there's enough evidence to put the governor on trial. Now, the actual trial is held in the Senate, and this is where they pursue the conviction. Uh, if and so they'll have a typical trial, but instead of 12 jurors in a normal trial, there'll be 31 state senators, and they will see evidence. They will have lawyers arguing back and forth. They will have witnesses and cross examinations, all those things. So that trial will be held in the Senate. And if 2/3 of the Senate, and that's a tough threshold to reach, if 2/3 of the Senate feel that the governor is guilty, then the governor will be convicted and removed from office. If you are convicted, you will be removed from office and you are disqualified from serving in any other statewide office. There's been only one governor that was removed and that was impeached and convicted, and it was James Paul Ferguson, who had served as governor from 1915 to 1917. And basically, he was removed because of his battle with the Board of Regents of the University of Texas. Now, let's take a look at the formal powers of the governor of Texas. First, let's take a look at the tenure of the governor of Texas. The governor of Texas serves a 4-year term. That means the governor of Texas is up for re-election, excuse me, every 4 years, and with no term limits. The governor of Texas can rerun for the seat as many times as the state of Texas and the people of Texas will elect the person. So there are no term limits. Also, the governor, some of the formal powers are appointive powers, although compared to other states, the appointive powers of the Texas governor are weak. Because as we've mentioned before, many of the executive branch positions that work with the governor in the executive branch are elected separately. So that makes it difficult for the governor to appoint people to positions of power. And so when he does give out appointed positions, he gives them out to people who have helped him out along the way, oftentimes to big campaign donors. Also, once a person is in a seat, the removal powers are very weak. So the governor of Texas has weak appointive powers and weak removal powers. As far as a budgetary power, meaning controlling the budget and the funding to state agencies, generally compared to other states, the governor is weak in that area, except for the fact that the governor does have what's called the line item veto, that he can go in and basically X out individual lines or individual items within the budget. And so that there's some power there, but generally the governor does not have extensive budgetary control. Legislative, as far as how the governor interacts with the legislature and in passing laws, the governor has the power of the general veto, as most all executives do, the president and other governors. They can veto legislation. They can also line item veto parts of the legislation. And of course, like the U.S. government and like U.S. Congress over the president, the legislature can override with a 2/3 vote any veto by the governor. Judicial powers of the governor. For those that are on death row that are scheduled for execution, the governor can issue 130-day stay of execution. All other recommended by the Pardons and Parole Board. So the governor does have the power to stay executions if he deems it necessary for whatever circumstances. And military powers. The governor appoints the adjutant general of the state National Guard and directs his actions, kind of like the commander-in-chief of the state National Guard. Just like the president's commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, the state National Guard comes under the purvey of the governor. Now let's talk about the administrative agencies of the state of Texas. As I mentioned, or I touched on briefly and in passing earlier, Texas has a what's called a plural executive. A plural executive. And what that means is that the many people that work in the executive branch, the many offices in the executive branch, those agencies that carry out the laws, they are elected separately. So they are not beholden to each other or to the governor because they have been elected by the people on their own in a separate election, and therefore they do not have to be held accountable to anybody except the voters. And so let's take a look take a look at the elected officials or the major elected offices or agencies in the bureaucracy or in the state executive branch. First, the Attorney General is the chief counsel to the governor and the state agencies. It's chief lawyer, basically, and gives them legal advice on a variety of matters. If this person is elected. Also elected is the Comptroller of Public Accounts. It's basically the tax collector and investor of state funds. Since we run on 2-year budget cycles here in Texas, the Comptroller of Public Accounts must kind of guess based on the economy and estimated tax revenues that are going to be coming in. They give this estimate of how much money there will be to spend for the 2-year budget to the legislature, who in turn makes a budget. So it's a very important job. Commissioner of the General Land Office, also elected, administers state-owned lands and offshore territories, things like state parks, fishing areas. Commissioner of Agriculture promotes and regulates agricultural production and enforces rules regarding agricultural and farming. Texas Railroad Commission regulates transportation and the oil and gas industry. A lot of people don't understand that the regulation of the oil and gas industry comes from the Texas Railroad Commission. So keep that in mind. And then the State Board of Education oversees elementary and secondary public education, oftentimes controversially, because these people are elected and many of them don't have any educational experience, and it's kind of a sore spot with me. But I think that anybody that is making legislation or recommendations as far as curriculum for schools, for public schools, they should have some public school or education background. And oftentimes they don't. All you have to do is win an election. Continuing with the administrative agencies in the state of Texas, there's also a couple of appointed agency heads, single head appointed agencies. The most notable is the Secretary of State, who's the chief election officer and keeper of state records. This person is appointed by the governor of Texas, and it's a pretty powerful job. When you determine oftentimes election rules or determine or the maybe the arbitrator in election disputes, and the keeper of state records. The Commissioner for Health and Human Services coordinates health-related programs and agencies that deal with any type of state or federal health programs. And then there are other state boards and commissions that are minor that we're not going to go into at this point. Now, other legislative agencies, the Legislative Budget Board. Now, this is the very important agency, this Legislative Budget Board, because this is the board or the agency that prepares the state 2-year budget. Of course, they get the estimates of revenue from the Comptroller of Public Accounts, and then they sit down with that number, how much money will be coming in the next 2 years, and they create a budget. They decide where the money will be spent. Then there's also the Texas Legislative Council, who works with the governor and within the executive branch to promote a legislative agenda, get bills passed that they want to get passed. The Legislative Audit Committee and State Auditor's Office, which basically they do just that. They audit the agencies within the executive branch, and then the legislative reference library. Continuing on, we also have something called in the state of Texas called the Sunset Advisory Commission. The Sunset Advisory Commission. Now, this is an agency that's responsible for making recommendations to the legislature for changes in structure and organization of state agencies. So, if this board looks and sees an agency that kind of maybe its day has passed, maybe its functions are no longer needed, they can recommend that this agency be abolished or altered or changed in some way. So it's a good way to kind of regulate the bureaucracy and hopefully limit the growth of the bureaucracy. Because one of the important things to remember about bureaucracy itself is once you create an agency or some government entity, it's very difficult to get rid of them. But anyway, the Sunset Advisory Commission consists of 5 state senators, 5 House members, and 2 public members. Now, as far as state employees in the state of Texas, and most state employees do work for the state executives, the executive agencies. Employees are the single largest state expenditure. We don't have a civil service system here, meaning it's not a merit-based system like they have in some states. Oftentimes it's not what you know, it's who you know with regard to getting the best state jobs. So there's no testing system in the application process for working for the state of Texas. 76% of state employees in the state of Texas work in the following 5 areas: corrections, that's basically the prison systems, highways department, public welfare, hospitals, and higher education. And in conclusion, all information in this presentation, as well as all information in the textbook and chapters of the textbook, may appear on the exams.